Augustine's Rule, a commentary by Adler Zumkeller, OSA, Chapter 11, Community of Goods and Communion of Love. Religious life established by St. Augustine was a life of evangelical poverty and complete sharing of earthly goods. Those houses in which he lived followed the principle established in the first apostolic community. They held all things in common, and distribution was made to each one according to each one's need. Acts chapter 4. At the beginning of his rule, Augustine has already proposed this same norm for us today. In the present chapter, chapter 5 of the rule, Augustine explains in detail what this means by applying it to the circumstances of everyday monastic life. Augustine begins by harking back to the question of clothing, for in his monasteries clothing was regulated by the spirit of evangelical poverty and in the interests of community life. The clothing of his monks and nuns probably differed from that of laypersons only in being made of simpler material, and perhaps also in its darker color. How did people dress at that time? The basic garment was a tunic or long white gown of wool or linen with long sleeves. A girdle or belt was worn around the hips. Over the tunic, the people of North Africa wore a birrus or coat-like cloak of the same material that had a hood for protection against the sun. Augustine mentions that women also wore a veil. A veil worn by consecrated virgins was to be thick enough to hide their hair completely. These garments, the material of which differed according to the season, were washed regularly. The rule of Augustine is insistent that the washing and storage be the community's business rather than the individual's. In fact, Augustine thinks the ideal is for individuals not to receive back from the wash the same garment they had before, but a different one, and even at times a more modest one that had been worn by someone else. He does, however, allow the practice of receiving back the same garment that had been worn before. But on one point he will allow no concession. At least the storage of clothing is to be a communal matter. He wants but a single wardrobe in a monastery, just as there is but a single pantry and kitchen from which all receive their food. In the changed conditions of life in our time, this regulation can no longer be followed to the letter, and other arrangements have to be made. As an understanding and prudent man, Augustine would in all likelihood have no objection to this were he alive today. Here again, his primary concern is with the spirit, that is, that we should try to live our religious life in the spirit of evangelical poverty and the sharing of goods. He warns that the spirit of evangelical poverty has vanished when disputes and murmuring arise on this account, because some complain that they received poorer clothing than they had before, and think it is beneath them to wear the kind of clothing worn by others. Augustine makes vividly clear the great lack of perfection that such dissatisfaction betrays. Complainers of this kind worry about clothing for the body and are oblivious of the far greater concern they ought to have for the holy and inner garment of the heart, that is, the robe of grace and divine filiation that makes them beautiful and pleasing in the eyes not only of human beings, but of God. A little later, Augustine will again reprove this reversal of right order, pointing out that too great a desire for clean clothing can be the source of interior stains on the soul. He goes on here to speak of another practical point of monastic poverty that calls for regulation. What gifts can outsiders give us? Here again, he insists strongly on complete fidelity to his ideal of poverty. Everything we receive as a gift belongs to the community. The rule makes clear that we can lay no claim to such gifts or dispose of them as we wish. Rather, we are obliged, in conscience, to hand them over to superiors, who will add them to the common store and dispose of them as they see fit. Augustine would have nothing to do with gifts intended not for the community, but exclusively for individuals. He showed the same strictness even toward himself, despite his episcopal office. In a sermon to the people, he remarks, "I too receive what I need from the common store of the community, for I know that what I have I may possess only as a property of the community. Therefore, beloved, I do not want you to bring me gifts intended for my sole use, as supposedly more fitting to my station." Sermon 356. He was well aware of human weakness. He knew how even persons who have vowed themselves to a life of apostolic sharing of possessions, and who in doing so may have renounced a sizable property, can later become attached to trifles. In the sermon just cited, he therefore asks the Christians of his episcopal city to make gifts only to the community. Any gift you wish to make it to all. Give as much as your hearts desire. From what is given to the community as a gift, all will receive what they need. Put it in the bin for offerings, and we shall all share in it. Sermon 356. The community of goods Augustine has in mind is one that is sustained by the spirit of selfless love, which makes individuals seek only the good of the whole. Even the faithful practice of personal poverty is meant to help us overcome all selfish striving and dedicate ourselves entirely in love to the community and our apostolic or caritative tasks. This brings us to a further aspect of the matter, which Augustine develops rather beautifully in this chapter of the Rule. Concern for the community. The Creator himself made self-love part of our nature. Augustine writes, "The human spirit is so formed that at every moment it loves itself." The Trinity 14:18. As a result of the fall, however, this divinely willed self-love has gone astray. It now tends to become a self-seeking love that looks only to the individual's interests. Self-centeredness has no eye for the distress or the legitimate concerns and claims of others. It can become so excessive that all of the person's thoughts, intentions, and actions are focused exclusively on the self. Over against these distortions of human self-love, the Rule of Augustine sets the Christian ideal of life as expressed in the words of St. Paul. Love is not self-seeking. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. In Augustine's view, this basic orientation of Christian love should find expression in everyday life, chiefly in the way that we use our energies in the joyous and selfless service of our brothers or sisters in the community. he writes, "None shall perform any task for their own benefit, but all your work shall be done for the community with greater zeal and more dispatch than if each one of you were to work for yourself alone." By community he understands, of course, not an impersonal institution, but the society of those who, along with ourselves, seek to be intent upon God with one heart and one soul. This sentence is thus, as it were, the golden rule which the saint gives us, his spiritual sons and daughters, for our everyday religious life. The effort to put it into practice will free us increasingly from narrow self-centeredness and fill us with love of Christ. To some extent, this sentence of the rule reduces our entire monastic ideal to a brief formula. This instruction of Augustine is a declaration of war on all self-centeredness. He wants us to have but one heart and one soul, many bodies, but not many souls, many bodies, but not many hearts. Commentary on Psalm 132. We must live selflessly for the religious community and make its concerns and tasks increasingly our own. We must learn to feel and think ever more fully with the community. We should therefore be asking not what does the community give to me, but what can I give to the community? Here too the words of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 6. Anyone who sows generously will reap generously. Anyone who gives much will receive much in return. When we devote ourselves unselfishly to the community, we are devoting ourselves to the cause of Jesus Christ. See Philippians chapter 2 verse 21. Augustine leaves no doubt about the importance he attaches to the fullest possible obedience to his instruction. Know then that the more you devote yourselves to the community rather than to your private interests, the more you have advanced. This is certainly a bold statement, that our concern for the community is an unequivocal sign of our interior state of perfection and a sure standard for our progress in goodness. How can it be said that this concern for the community reveals our degree of perfection? Augustine gives the answer. A readiness to sacrifice self for the sake of the religious community signifies a genuine love of neighbor. Those who are really, honestly devoted to the community without seeking thereby their own selves, their own honor, their own advantage, make it clear that they truly love their neighbors and are ready to sacrifice themselves for them. Augustine writes here in the rule, "For love, as it is written, is not self-seeking." 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Meaning that it places the common good before its own, not its own before the common good. And in his explanation of the Gospel of John, he writes, "Those who truly love their neighbors, what else do they love in them but God?" On John's Gospel 65:2. Were he to apply this statement to us religious, he would probably say, those who truly love the community, what else do they love in it but God? A sacrificial concern for the monastic community shows that our own love for God and neighbor is genuine. In these sentences of the rule, Augustine shows us a sure way to Christian perfection. No extraordinary feats are required, but only a simple fidelity in everyday life. Nor are difficult works of penance demanded, but only a love that serves continuously. Of course, this sure way likewise requires persevering goodwill and a spirit of sacrifice, such as only God's grace can bestow. For here too Augustine's saying applies. It is a great thing to be faithful in the smallest matters. On Christian Instruction, Book 4, 1835.